Good morning. The committee will come to order. Pursuant to notice, the Committee on Science and Technology meets to consider the following measures. H.R. 6063, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration Authorization Act of 2008. We will now proceed with the markup. H.R. 6063 was introduced by Space and Aeronautics Subcommittee Chairman Udall, and I was pleased to be an original co-sponsor of the legislation. I was even more pleased that Mr. Hall and Mr. Finney also joined as original co-sponsors. This is a bipartisan bill in every sense of the word, and I want to thank them and their staff for their productive involvement in moving this legislation forward. That constructive approach is reflected in their active participation in helping to craft the manager's amendment that will be considered in just a while. I am emphasizing the bipartisanship consensus we have on this bill because I think it's important that we send a strong message to the next administration, whether it turns out to be a Democratic or Republican one, that the Congress believes that NASA is important and worthy of the nation's support. H.R. 6063 makes clear that NASA is relevant to the nation's innovation agenda, that it has a key role to play in ensuring the future health of our nation's aviation system, and that it is critical to the nation's efforts to better understand our climate and the changes facing the Earth system. In addition, H.R. 6063 demonstrates that a properly structured human spaceflight and exploration program can provide dividends technologically, scientifically, and geopolitically, and is worthy of the nation's investment in it. Yet, H.R. 6063 also demonstrates that a relevant space and aeronautics program is affordable. The baseline authorization for fiscal year 2009 represents simply an inflationary increase of 2.8% over FY 2008 authorization level that was enacted into law in the NASA Authorization Act of 2005. It also increases funding for NASA's relative to FY 08 appropriation for NASA at a rate consistent with the applied to R&D agencies in last year's America Competes Act. That is a reflection of the fact that NASA's activities have an important role to play in the nation's innovation agenda. It is also a reflection of the fact that we need to ensure that NASA has sufficient resources for all of its important tasks, and the nation is asking it to carry out, and I believe that this bill does just that. There are many important provisions in the NASA Authorization Act of 2008, including a special funding augmentation to help narrow the human spaceflight gap and the nation is facing after the retirement of the shuttle. Since members have already familiarized themselves with the contents of the legislation, I will not take time now to restate those provisions. Instead, I will just close by saying that I think H.R. 6063 is a good bill that will help prepare NASA for a relevant, productive future, and I urge my colleagues to support it. I now recognize Mr. Hall to present his remarks.
Mr. Chairman, of course, I thank you for scheduling the markup, and as you say, I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor of this bill, and I hope other members here today are going to consider adding their support to it. H.R. 6063 is a one-year bill that demonstrates Congress' commitment to maintain a strong and vital space program and will also serve as a signal to a new administration that NASA has deep support within this Congress. I think that's important. Passage of this bill is very important for another reason. I worry that if we allow NASA's authorization to lapse, the next presidential administration may interpret our failure to act as a sign of weakness for NASA, and that in turn might tempt a new administration to divert agency resources. I don't want that to happen. I don't think any of us in this room want that to happen. The bill before us today contains a number of important provisions. It authorizes $19.2 billion for NASA for FY09 and provides an additional $1 billion to accelerate development of the new crew vehicle launch system. It emphasizes that NASA should maintain a strong and balanced array of science, aeronautics, and human spaceflight programs. It also directs NASA to fly out its full manifest of shuttle missions, including those dedicated to flying spare parts to the International Space Station, as well as adding a flight to take the Alpha magnetic spectrometer to the ISS, as we originally committed to do some years ago. The AMS was stricken from the shuttle manifest following the Columbia tragedy, but I believe given the large investment in resources, we ought to make good on our original commitment to fly this expensive investment to the ISS. H.R. 6063 directs NASA to continue the important task of developing the Constellation system, which will provide our country with a modern and more robust and safer manned spaceflight capability that will enable our astronauts to fly out of low Earth orbit, an ability we haven't had since the retirement of Apollo over 30 years ago, as most of you are aware. Once the shuttle is retired at the end of this decade, our country will have to buy seats from the Russians for as long as 5 years to assure a U.S. presence on the International Space Station. Our payments for rides on their spacecraft have not yet been negotiated, but it'll be expensive, and sadly, we'll be making these purchases at a time when NASA will be laying off thousands of engineers and technicians from the shuttle program. In an effort to minimize our reliance on the Russians, as I mentioned a moment ago, this bill authorizes an additional $1 billion to speed up development of the new Constellation system. This additional investment is more than justified. This bill also includes a number of provisions to encourage NASA, working with the private sector, to foster development of a domestic commercial cargo launch capability primarily designed to take supplies to our space station. In addition, H.R. 6063 includes language directing NASA to solicit for commercial crew launch capability. Turning to other parts of NASA, H.R. 6063 embraces a number of recommendations that were put forward by witnesses from government, industry, and academia who testified in hearings before this committee and the Space and Aeronautics Subcommittee over the previous 18 months. These are sensible provisions designed to strengthen aeronautics, space science, and earth science research programs, encourage technology risk reduction policies, and activities, and foster efficient technology transfer from NASA to other federal agencies and to the private sector, and detect and mitigate the threat of the near-Earth objects, and research and monitor the effects of space weather on satellites. This list is not exhaustive, but I want to mention these few examples and take this time to emphasize to all members the breadth of this bill and how it improves upon many of NASA's activities and programs. Before closing, I want to point out that during development of this bill, the Democratic staff and leadership have been very open and forthright, sharing early ideas and drafts of this bill with our Republican staff. It's been a close and productive partnership. I want to especially recognize and praise the hard work of Dick Oberman and others. And Mr. Chairman, I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. I concur. Dick Oberman is a real asset to our committee, as we just have excellent staff on both sides. Also concur with your statement. This is a strong message of bipartisan unity to the next administration. Now I ask unanimous consent that the bill is considered as read. And does anyone else wish to be recognized? Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Udall, the chairman of the subcommittee. Pardon me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief, but I think it's important to acknowledge that the bill came out of the subcommittee on May 20th without amendment, with a voice vote. Chairman Gordon noted that this is a strong bill that has bipartisan support. And I want to take a moment to thank Mr. Hall and Mr. Feeney in particular for their efforts on the legislation. Their support and thoughtful inputs made this a better bill. And they have excellent staff members I'd like to acknowledge, including Ed Fetterman, Ken Monroe, and Lee Arnold. And I want to emphasize and echo what the chairman said about the subcommittee staff led by Dick Oberman. He's an amazing resource, and I've really enjoyed working with him over the last 2 years to put together a bill that will put NASA on track and keep it on track. So I'd want to thank Dick and Pam Whitney, Alan Lee, and Devin Bryant for their efforts. Of course, Wendy Adams on my congressional staff has been phenomenal as well. We've received a lot of letters of endorsement, including ones from the Aerospace Industries Association, the General Aviation Manufacturers Association, the American Meteorological Society, the Planetary Society, the University Space Research Association, IEE, the National Space Society, AIAA, and ASME. And the legislation is really a result of the testimony and that constructive input from many, many witnesses, outside experts, and organizations, and I'd like to thank all of them for their insights. The guiding principle of the legislation is that NASA should be, and I believe is, an agency that can be a strong catalyst for dealing with important national concerns. And that's why we've focused on measures to ensure that the nation's human exploration efforts will be carried out in a manner that maximizes our return on our national investment in it, and that the International Space Station will be utilized as productively as possible. And that's also why the bill focuses on building a strong earth sciences research and applications program, as well as strengthening NASA's Aeronautics R&D program, which will be very critical to our nation's future aviation system. I could go on at some length about all the great features in the bill, but I know we'd all like to proceed to the markup, so let me put the rest of my remarks in the record. And in closing, I'll note, as Chairman Gordon did, that this year marks the 50th anniversary of the birth of the U.S. space program and the establishment of NASA, and I believe that H.R. 6063 will help ensure that NASA's next 50 years will be as exciting and productive as its first 50, and I urge all the members here to support it at today's markup. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Udall. Job well done. Mr. Finney is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I could, but I won't reread the statement of support that I gave at the beginning of our very expeditious subcommittee markup. I want to join Chairman Udall and Chairman Gordon and Ranking Member Hall in thanking the majority party members on the subcommittee, but also the staff on both sides, as has been mentioned appropriately, have done a fantastic job. What we've done is to lay out a bipartisan blueprint for sustaining a healthy and vigorous NASA during the next administration. I think Chairman Gordon pointed out the importance of this bill. The next administration is going to look for a starting place in terms of space and NASA policy. I think that we have laid out a great starting place, no matter who the next president may be. And I would note that apparently my colleague from Florida, Senator Nelson, has had complimentary things to say about the bill that came out of the subcommittee. We provide good stewardship for all enterprises in NASA's portfolio, Earth and space sciences, aeronautics, and human spaceflight. Because I represent Kennedy Space Center, and I saw Congresswoman Giffords there the other day. She was a little bit more nervous than I was for inexplicable reasons. I want to particularly note the unambiguous endorsement of America's human spaceflight program. We've come a very long way since the loss of the Shuttle Columbia over 5 years ago. This bill continues that progress by providing much-needed stability in our strategy and architecture for human spaceflight. Here's an example of bipartisan leadership during a time of difficult challenges for the program. The manager's amendment includes a section directing the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy to establish an interagency committee and study the issues raised by locating a commercial space launch range in close proximity to a federal launch range. In order to have viable commercial launch operations in the United States, effective coordination and cooperation must exist between potential commercial ranges and existing federal ranges. This issue is of constant concern to Florida Space Coast, as advised with international competitors as a site for launching commercial payloads. I again thank the talented and accomplished staff on both sides of the aisle. The tone and tenor of discussions and negotiations continue this committee's cooperative and inclusive approach to dealing with the areas within our jurisdiction, and with that would yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Chairman, just one half a minute, if I might. Back when I was in the Texas Senate, we had all of those beautiful wives of the astronauts that would come to Austin and from time to time, and they would always tell us when we were kind of courting them, about their husbands, and one said, "Don't call me unless my husband's on television." That meant he's going around and around the world. Now, we've got a lady on here that her husband is on television, and seriously, we need to pray for him and join her in the prayers for him and all the others that they get down safely. Thank you.
As usual, Mr. Hall speaks well for all of us. If there are no other statements to be made, then I ask unanimous consent that the bill is considered as read and open to amendment at any point, and that the members proceed with amendments in the order of the roster. Without objection, so ordered. The first amendment on the roster is a manager's amendment offered by myself. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 6063 offered by Mr. Gordon of Tennessee.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize myself for 5 minutes to explain the amendment. I have what I believe is a straightforward amendment that makes a number of technical corrections to the bill, clarifies several of the existing provisions of the bill, and adds some additional language. It clarifies that the bill intends for NASA to ensure significant involvement by the universities and industry in NASA's Aeronautics R&D program. It also clarifies that the responsibilities of the Joint Aeronautics R&D Advisory Committee established in the bill. In the planetary science area, the amendment adds additional language on support of the robotic Mars science mission, as well as a sense of Congress provision on the importance of the Outer Planets program. And finally, the amendment includes two new provisions. The first is a commercial launch range study to be carried out by OSTP to identify issues and challenges associated with establishing such launch ranges. And second, it is a provision to establish a new outreach and technology assistance program to help transfer NASA's knowledge and technology to the nation's small businesses. We have worked closely with the minority in crafting this amendment, and I appreciate their assistance and input. I believe that this is a non-controversial amendment, and I would urge my colleagues to support it. Is there further discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Hall is recognized.
Your amendment makes a number of clarifying changes, and some good provisions were added in part through the advocacy of my friend and Texas colleague, Representative John Culberson. And you've mentioned the commercial launch range and Mr. Lampson's aid for the small business area. And I support the manager's amendment and urge all members to lend their support to it as well. And I yield back my time.
There's no further discussion on the amendment. If no, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The amendment has it, or the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The second amendment on the roster is offered by the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Gingrey. Dr. Gingrey, are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
I am, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 089, amendment to H.R. 6063, offered by Mr. Gingrey of Georgia.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman,
The gentleman is recognized.
I reserve a point of order on the amendment.
The gentleman is, Dr. Gingrey is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment with a reservation held by Dr. Baird.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I certainly agree that with you and your statements and the ranking member's statements, H.R. 6063 is definitely a strong and bipartisan piece of legislation, and I commend Mr. Udall and Mr. Feeney for working so closely together on this bill. I think we can make it better, though, and I actually have two amendments, and let me describe the first one. The First Amendment would correct a misguided provision, and that provision is Section 526 of the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007, that prevents the federal government, including NASA, from developing and implementing alternative fuels from our own domestic sources. This First Amendment is very similar to a bipartisan amendment to the fiscal year 2009 National Defense Authorization Act that I submitted to the Rules Committee, along with Mr. Hensley of Texas, Ms. Blackburn of Tennessee, and Mr. Abercrombie of Hawaii. Unfortunately, the majority did not make that amendment in order, but it's my hope that the Science Committee will engage in a full and an open debate on a clear difference of philosophies on energy policy that exists between the Republicans and our Democratic colleagues. Over the past 5 years, NASA has seen an increase of almost 400% in spending for jet fuel, from $4.5 million in fiscal year 2003 to $18.3 million in fiscal year 2007. Simply put, the growth NASA has experienced in fuel cost is simply out of control, and it has therefore been actively researching alternative fuels to help reduce fuel costs, not only for itself, but also for other federal agencies, and in particular for the Department of Defense. It is estimated the Department of Defense, mainly through the Air Force, utilizes 480,000 gallons of refined petroleum products every day. 480,000 gallons a day. And because of the rising cost of fuel, it's estimated that in the fiscal year 08, the additional cost to the Department of Defense and to the federal government will be $9 billion. Now, that's just the increased costs. Mr. Chairman, NASA has historically been on the cutting edge of innovation, numerous contributions to technologies that we use on a daily basis in the United States. We all know about that. Currently, NASA is partnering with the Air Force and is already aggressively conducting research to convert domestic energy sources such as coal to liquid, natural gas, biomass, and oil shale. It's estimated that in the West, 4 or 5 states in the West, the amount of oil shale, which is, I'm not that familiar with the product, but it's not a liquid, it's kind of a semi-solid. But if we utilize that and converted it into a petroleum product, it could produce something like 3 trillion additional barrels of oil for use by the federal government. 3 trillion. Now, put it in perspective, when the first oil well was drilled in Pennsylvania back in the late 1800s, since that time, the whole world has used about 1 trillion barrels of petroleum. And this oil shale has a capacity, domestic, right here in River City, if you will, of producing 3 trillion additional barrels of petroleum. And as I say, the NASA is currently partnering with the Air Force. It's conducting the research to make these conversions into cleaner and more economically alternative to traditional jet fuel. The price is, of course, rising at a time when we could best utilize the research for emerging technologies for alternative fuels. With Section 526, the Democratic majority has really effectively stymied innovation at NASA that could potentially help us reduce our dependence on foreign oil. It basically says in Section 526 that the federal government cannot utilize any of these other sources if it results in any increased carbon footprint. Now, I'm not talking about tonnage of CO2. I'm talking about maybe even an ounce more. And when we have to balance and consider the amount of money that we're spending and what we're going through and what the American public is going through in this time, to not put aside that misguided policy so that our federal government doesn't literally go broke, I think is a big mistake. So, Mr. Chairman, that basically is my amendment. I would literally strike Section 526 and have that as part of this NASA bill, which, again, I think H.R. 6063 is a good, strong, bipartisan bill, as you said, but I think we can make it much better with this amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Gingrey. Does the gentleman wish to be heard on his point of order?
Mr. Chair, I make a point of order that pursuant to Clause 7 of House Rule 16, the amendment is not germane to the underlying bill being amended.
Dr. Gingrey, do you wish to be heard on the point of order?
Mr. Chairman, I do. I don't see how. I respect my colleague, of course, Dr. Baird, but I don't understand. Maybe he could explain to us why this amendment would not be germane. As I just pointed out in my discussion, NASA is currently doing research on utilizing these alternative domestic sources and has a partnership with the Department of Defense so that they're not duplicating their research efforts and sharing that information, and is just on the verge probably of being able to utilize that commercially. So I can't understand, maybe Dr. Baird can explain to us why he feels it's not germane.
I'd be happy to. First of all, the most important thing is the parliamentarian has advised us that it qualifies as not germane, but my understanding is that federal procurement laws are part of government reform and oversight and are not germane to this particular committee, and on that basis is why I offer the resolution.
Well, Mr. Chairman, if I could additionally comment on that, I guess what Dr. Baird is saying is that it's not germane because this amendment would change the bill to the point that some other committee then would have some jurisdiction over it, and it would have to be referred to the other committee that Dr. Baird mentioned. But why does that mean it's non-germane just because some other committee may have to look at it and have jurisdiction? We're not exactly killing ourselves, Mr. Chairman, up here getting things done. We're spending a lot of time on suspension bills, and the one that is coming up tomorrow in regard to the Chesapeake Bay, probably we're going to be spending time debating that, but it should be on suspension. We're wasting a lot of time. This is important stuff. Even if it does mean sequential referral, so be it if we make it a much better bill and save our country from going down the tube.
Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Ehlers is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I speak against the point of order and in favor of the amendment for perhaps somewhat different reasons. But as you know, I've fought very hard over the years to maintain this jurisdiction, the jurisdiction of this committee over various areas. And this problem that we're trying to correct here is a good example of what happens when committees that don't understand the science and don't have a jurisdiction over NASA, for example, pass regulations that just don't make sense. And the reason this doesn't make sense in the case of either aviation or space travel is that the primary requirement for fuel to be used for space travel or for aviation is to have a high energy density fuel. In other words, a lot of energy compared to the weight. Because with flying or space travel, weight means everything. You want to keep the weight as low as possible, but you need the maximum energy. So you want to buy fuels or find fuels or develop fuels that have the maximum energy density. In other words, the largest amount of energy available for the amount of weight of the fuel you're carrying. And I see this Section 526 basically saying, well, we don't care about that. We're just worried about the carbon footprint. Well, I'm worried about the carbon footprint, too. I want the smallest possible carbon footprint or tire tread or vapor trail through space, whatever you want to call it. But the point is simply let NASA and all the aviation and space researchers decide what is the best fuel, what's the highest energy density for the minimum carbon footprint. In other words, you have to balance two things, energy density and footprint, and not put everything on the footprint itself. So I think this Section 526 is just pure nonsense. It should be left up to this committee and to the scientific community to try to work out this particular problem. And by having another committee step in which doesn't understand the science, we end up with this problem. So I respect the parliamentarian, and but there's a problem here that has to be addressed, and the problem arises because, once again, a committee outside of the Science Committee tackled a scientific issue and messed up on it. With that, I'll yield back.
Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Hall is asked to be recognized.
And I'll yield to Jim, Mr. Jim. Okay. But I'd like to 30 seconds first before I get you started, Jim, okay? I support, of course, the bill and speak in support of the amendment, and point of order has been raised, and that'll be a legal question. But, you know, when I was in law school, I think they had a four corners of the page ruling that you look at anything from everything that's within those four corners of the page, and you had legal reasons and then you had equitable reasons, and sometimes equity outweighed the legal, and I think that's what the professor here is saying, that this amendment's simple, and yet it addresses a problem that's created by an earlier law that hamstrings our federal agencies. It's an equitable thing to undo those shackles that are put on them, American taxpayers. And I think we're aware the energy bill that passed last year does little to advance energy independence for Americans, and actually takes options off the table for increasing the production of a number of domestic energy resources. Section 526 is one of the many sections that reduces options for Americans. This section prohibits any federal agency from entering into contracts to purchase many new fuel sources, such as coal to liquids, and those derived from tar sands and oil shale to power their fleets. Instead, the way the section's written, it could potentially also prohibit the purchase of ethanol and other biofuels. And some of us agree with that part, but we don't agree with others. But considering the fact that Americans are burdened with skyrocketing fuel costs, I think our nation continues to rely on foreign sources of energy. We ought to be looking for all and using all unconventional sources of energy that we can produce domestically. I just think that when we look at the pages from the four corners of the pages, and we see Section 526, it affects any federal agency that purchases fuel, and that includes NASA. NASA purchased $18.3 million of jet fuel just last year, and countless more to power their automobile fleet and manufacturing capabilities. And when we consider the fact that our nation is on an energy crisis created in part by a lack of domestic production of resources, this amendment would allow the purchases of new domestic resources and simply makes sense. I think it's equitable if you take the equity position in when you search and make a ruling on the legal I urge all my colleagues to pass this common sense amendment if the chair rules as correctly as I hope he's going to rule on this. And if he doesn't, I have a sneaking feeling we may be outvoted. But I have to yield my last 5 minutes to Mr. Sensenbrenner.
I thank the distinguished ranking member for yielding, and I'm going to be much quicker than 5 minutes or even 5 seconds. I would caution the chair to not to sustain the point of order that has been made by the gentleman from Washington State. This bill deals with NASA authorization. NASA authorization largely is what NASA procures and how it procures it. And if we accept the argument that the gentleman from Washington State has raised, then this entire bill would probably be non-germane and in the jurisdiction of the Committee on Government Reform and Oversight. That would be a terrible mistake. During my tenure as chair of this committee 10 years ago, we had some major tussles on jurisdictional issues, and it was largely with the Government Reform and Oversight Committee, and we were able to win most of those arguments. The way the House rules are written, the Waxman Committee can stick its nose into practically everything. If we do not stand up and fight for our jurisdiction, the nose of that camel will be under our tent, and before we know it, the entire camel will be there, and it will be our committee that ends up being irrelevant. I would just as soon have that committee be made irrelevant, but that will require an overruling of the point of order that the gentleman from Washington State has entered. Thank you.
The chair is prepared to rule. The gentleman's point of order is sustained. The amendment in question amends a provision in an unrelated act which has no relation to the subject matter of the underlying bill, which is NASA. The chair would also note that the amendment falls outside of the committee's jurisdiction. Thus, the amendment is not germane, and the point of order is sustained pursuant to Clause 7 of House Rule 16. Now, let me tell you in English what we mean here. The government reform has jurisdiction. The parliamentarians have made that very clear on this particular matter. And let me say that this is not a court of last resort, in that Dr. Gingrey can go to the Rules Committee, of which he's well familiar with, and ask that this be made in order on the floor. And let me also remind Mr. Sensenbrenner was giving us a little bit of history lesson. It's for many, many, many years, it has been the tradition and custom of this committee that when the chairman sends out a notice saying amendments are accepted, the chairman also says that reserves the right not to accept any amendment that has not been presented within 24 hours. And there's a reason for that. The reason is we've got a responsibility to put a good bill on the floor, and it needs to be vetted. This is not subcommittee. This is a full committee. I haven't even, we did not get this amendment until 9:30 last night. And if you were looking for a conspiracy, you might say it was waited late so that we couldn't get to the parliamentarians and ask about it. There was if this was so important, it could have been brought at the subcommittee level. It could have been brought more than 24 hours. I don't think that anyone thinks that there hasn't been a lack of, or there's a lack of cooperation and collaboration. And so, not even having read this bill, it really would make me feel uncomfortable just in an honest situation to put something on the floor that hasn't been vetted. It's not necessarily the concept, but it's the way it's written. We just don't know. So, again, I think certainly there is a significant parliamentary position here, and there's a substantive position, and I would say to Dr. Gingrey, I would suggest that he go to the subcommittee, rather to the Rules Committee, and I will not object when he does that. So now there is a third.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
If it's the appropriate time, I want to reluctantly appeal the ruling of the chair. And it's not as much directed at the chairman, who I have great respect for and a great friendship with, but it's as much as
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to
by the parliamentarian, and I think the parliamentarian has given the committee and the chairman bad advice, and therefore I reluctantly but very firmly do appeal the ruling of the chair on this.
Chairman, I call the roll. Ask for recorded the vote.
I will table that motion. The question is on the gentleman's motion to lay the appeal on the ruling of the chair on the table. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, no.
No.
The ayes appear to have it.
Mr. Chairman, on that, I would request a recorded vote, please.
The clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Gordon. Chairman Gordon votes aye. Mr. Costello. Mr. Costello votes aye. Ms. Johnson. Ms. Woolsey. Ms. Woolsey votes aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall votes aye. Mr. Wu.
Aye.
Mr. Wu votes aye. Mr. Baird.
Aye.
Mr. Baird votes aye. Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller votes aye. Mr. Lipinski. Mr. Lipinski votes aye. Mr. Lampson. Mr. Lampson votes aye. Ms. Giffords. Ms. Giffords votes aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Ms. Richardson. Ms. Richardson votes aye. Mr. Konjorsky. Ms. Hooley. Ms. Hooley votes aye. Mr. Rothman. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Chandler. Mr. Chandler votes aye. Mr. Carnahan. Mr. Carnahan votes aye. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson votes aye. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill votes aye. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell votes aye. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner. Mr. Sensenbrenner votes no. Mr. Smith of Texas. Mr. Smith of Texas votes no. Mr. Roybacher. Mr. Bartlett. Mr. Bartlett votes no. Mr. Ehlers. Mr. Ehlers votes no. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas votes no. Mrs. Biggert. Mrs. Biggert votes no. Mr. Aiken. Mr. Aiken votes no. Mr. Feeney. Mr. Feeney votes no. Mr. Nagelbauer. Mr. Inglis. Mr. Reichert. Mr. Reichert votes no. Mr. McCall. Mr. McCall votes no. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart votes no. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes no. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith of Nebraska votes no. Mr. Brown.
Is anyone present who hasn't had a chance to vote? If not, the clerk will tally the votes.
Mr. Chairman, 20 members vote aye and 14 members vote no.
The third amendment on the roster is offered by the gentleman from Georgia, Dr. Gingrey. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
I am, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 090, amendment to H.R. 6063, offered by Mr. Gingrey of Georgia.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading, and without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, I would again reserve a point of order on the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Well, we're going to make a second attempt here for my colleagues, and this second amendment that I'm offering does address the very same issue that the previous amendment did, but it attempts to correct it in a different way. You've heard my explanation in regard to wanting to strike and repeal Section 526 of the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007, and the reasons for that. Because it's applicable to our entire federal government, and the numbers that I gave you, I think, are just absolutely staggering. But in any regard, we've had that battle, and I can count, and I heard that 2014 vote. So now I want to try to approach this in a more limited manner, but I think one that hopefully our colleagues can accept, because I believe that this amendment provides a good compromise that would tremendously benefit NASA. This amendment would allow the NASA administrator to use his discretion to provide a waiver to the agency. to make it exempt from the harmful provisions of Section 526. Just like the other amendment that I offered to H.R. 6063, this amendment is very similar to one offered by Mr. Bishop of Utah in the fiscal year 2009 National Defense Authorization Act. Unfortunately, that amendment was also not made in order by the Rules Committee. Again, I believe that this is also a common sense amendment that will help us get on the path to correcting harmful energy policies by granting NASA a waiver. And we're not talking about the rest of the federal government. We're not even talking about the Department of Defense. We're just talking about this agency, allowing the administrator a waiver from Section 526 in his discretion. I believe that it would allow the agency to continue developing technologies that utilize the resources that we have here in the United States. And we've talked about those: oil, shale, sand, tar, coal to liquid. And we can do it, and NASA is proving that it can be done in an environmentally safe fashion, so that we can reduce our dependence on foreign sources of energy and at the same time pay attention to our environment and make sure that we don't ignore that. I hope all my colleagues on the committee support this important amendment. It serves as a compromise, I think a fair compromise to allow for continued alternative fuel innovation by NASA and NASA only. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back my time.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain. Excuse me. Does the gentleman wish to be heard on his point of order?
Mr. Chair, I do very briefly. I would just point out that the gentleman repeatedly talks about sand, tars, and oil shale and coal to liquid. I don't think, to the best of my knowledge, NASA is planning to launch a rocket fueled by any of the aforementioned, but if so, I'll risk depriving them of that opportunity with this. And I do make a point of order that pursuant to Clause 7 of House Rule 16, the amendment is not germane to the underlying bill being amended.
Mr. Chairman.
First, I think, Mr. Hall, we need to recognize Dr. Gingrey to be heard on the point of order, and then he is welcome to yield to you.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I will take just a little time and then yield to the ranking member. Again, the same argument that I made before, but this one in spades. I mean, we're talking about NASA now. We're not talking about the other agencies of the federal government, and it is NASA that's doing most of the research currently ongoing, sharing that research with the Department of Defense, as I stated, in regard to how you can take these, this seed corn, if you will, oil shale and coal to liquid, and turn them into fuel. And this is domestic fuel that we have right here in River City. And as I pointed out, up to 3 trillion gallons potentially of our own source of energy that would be so much cheaper. Goodness gracious, $9 billion increased cost in 2008 because of what we have to pay to these foreign sources of petroleum. You just think about the savings and what we could do with that in regard to health care, and you know, I could go on and on. But I hope I made my point. I feel very strongly about this. I'm surprised that the point of order has been raised about germaneness, and I will yield to the distinguished ranking member the rest of my time.
Mr. Chairman, I certainly agree with Dr. Gingrey. And as I mentioned in discussing Dr. Gingrey's excellent First Amendment, the section from last year's energy bill that's in question takes energy options off the floor, off the table for Americans at a time when we really ought to be expanding those resources. The need to expand resources is certainly not a foreign concept to this administration. It's not a Republican wish or a Democratic wish. It's an American wish and something we have to do. In fact, the very agency that we're discussing today, NASA, is currently engaged in groundbreaking research on many of the fuels that this ill-conceived section prohibits federal agencies from purchasing. And as I look at the amendment, and once again, for the good it'll do, it shouldn't surprise any of us that an agency that's led the way to the future by leading a man to the moon and returning him safely to Earth, and which has just last week softly landed a probe on Mars to explore the red planet, would be, again, be leading the way to energy independence. This is an energy thrust, and this amendment's simple. It simply says administrator may. It doesn't say shall. Shall is not in this amendment anywhere. He may waive the prohibition, and goes on to be more definite in his sole discretion. I just think it's a good amendment, and I hope that the chairman will give us a good support in his wisdom and his great Tennessee background at the University School of Law down there to overrule, to support this motion.
I will give the ranking member 3 years of law school and several years of practicing law. The ruling here, the chair is prepared to rule. The gentleman's point of order is sustained. The amendment in question alters a government-wide procurement policy by examining one single agency affected by this procurement policy. Government-wide procurement policy is not within the jurisdiction of the Committee on Science and Technology, and the consequences of the amendment falls outside of the committee's jurisdiction. Thus, the amendment is not germane, and point of order is sustained pursuant to Clause 7 of Rule 16. And once again, let me point out that this amendment was not received until 9:33 last night when, like most of you, I had left the office and I happened to be in bed with a sinus infection. Where you were is your own business. And I would also, again, state that Dr. Gingrey has the right and privilege of being able to go to the Rules Committee and for this to be heard on the floor in the appropriate manner.
Mr. Chairman,
Dr. Gingrey is recognized.
I move to appeal the ruling of the chair.
Mr. Chair, I would move to lay the appeal of the ruling of the chair on the table.
The question is on the gentleman's motion to lay the appeal of the ruling of the chair on the table. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
No.
The ayes appear to have it.
Mr. Chairman, on that I would ask for a recorded vote.
The clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Gordon. Chairman Gordon votes aye. Mr. Costello. Mr. Costello votes aye. Ms. Johnson. Ms. Woolsey. Ms. Woolsey votes aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall votes aye. Mr. Wu. Mr. Wu votes aye. Mr. Baird. Mr. Baird votes aye. Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller votes aye. Mr. Lipinski. Mr. Lipinski votes aye. Mr. Lamson. Mr. Lamson votes aye. Ms. Giffords. Ms. Giffords votes aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Ms. Richardson. Ms. Richardson votes aye. Mr. Konjorski. Mr. Konjorski votes aye. Ms. Hooley. Ms. Hooley votes aye. Mr. Rothman. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross votes aye. Mr. Chandler. Mr. Chandler votes aye. Mr. Carnahan. Mr. Carnahan votes aye. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson votes aye. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill votes aye. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell votes aye. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner. Mr. Sensenbrenner votes no. Mr. Smith of Texas. Mr. Smith of Texas votes no. Mr. Rohrbacher. Mr. Bartlett. Mr. Bartlett votes no. Mr. Ehlers. Mr. Ehlers votes no. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas votes no. Mrs. Biggert. Mrs. Biggert votes no. Mr. Aiken. Mr. Aiken votes no. Mr. Feeney. Mr. Feeney votes no. Mr. Nagelbauer. Mr. Nagelbauer votes no. Mr. Inglis. Mr. Reichert. Mr. Reichert votes no. Mr. McCall. Mr. McCall votes no. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart votes no. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes no. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Smith of Nebraska. No. Mr. Smith of Nebraska votes no. Mr. Brown.
Are there any members whose vote was not recorded? If not, the clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, 22 members vote aye and 15 members vote no.
The amendment to table the motion is carried. Are there other amendments? If no, then the vote is on the bill. H.R. 6063 as amended. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. I recognize Mr. Hall to offer a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 6063 as amended to the House with a recommendation that the bill as amended do pass. Furthermore, I move staff be instructed to prepare the legislative report and make necessary technical and conforming changes, and that the chairman take all necessary steps to bring the bill before the House for consideration. I yield back.
The question is on the motion to report the bill favorably. Those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The bill is favorably reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Members will have 2 subsequent calendar days in which to submit supplemental, minority, or additional views on the measure, ending Monday, June 9th at 9 a.m. I move pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 22 of the Rules of the House of Representatives that the committee authorize the chairman to offer such motions as may be necessary in the House to adopt and pass H.R. 6063, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration Authorization Act of 2008 as amended. Without objection, so ordered. I thank everyone for their participation today.
Good
and the members, this is now conclude the committee markup.